All right, it's 6:30, so we can go ahead and get rolling. Hello, my name is Regan Pafal. I'll be teaching this webinar. I teach graphic design and art over at Iowa Western. And I also mentor on most Adobe programs at DoSpace. So once the quarantine period is over, feel free to ask for more help, and I'm always willing to help. So we're going to take a look at Adobe Photoshop today, and particularly what we're going to look at is Adobe Photoshop for photographers. Phil, if you want to start up Photoshop and follow along with other images, that can be useful if it's good for you. But mostly this one's going to be in lecture format, just because we've got only an hour to go through it. And the first thing I actually want to take a look at is something called Adobe Bridge, which comes with Photoshop when you purchase it or subscribe to it, I guess, these days. So this is a program called Adobe Bridge. Let me know if you can't see or you're having any issues looking at screen. Let me know if anything's missing. And give me a second because my chat disappeared. There we go. So Adobe Bridge comes with Adobe Photoshop, and the main purpose of this program is sorting and tagging images. So if you are a photographer and you're shooting in RAW format, this is a program that allows you to relatively quickly go through and look at individual files in RAW format and to rate them. And just really more than how this thing works, I just wanted to let you guys know that this is here. And it's fairly simple to get started, and you can use it to bring in your photos by clicking here, and it'll allow you to pick an import, a place to import from, and then it'll allow you to go through and view individual photos for you to pick and then open up into Photoshop. So if you are somebody who's working in RAW format, it's very useful to open up and get used to this program. And if you already use Adobe Lightroom, this is what the Adobe Lightroom's library feature is based off of. So this came before it, and library and Lightroom was based off it. And it does a lot more than just organizing, but it's those are advanced features. Like you can do a bunch of batch renaming in here, but very good for professional photographers once you start getting a lot of images. So let's go to our focus today, which is going to be Photoshop. Yes. So Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom are both raster editing programs. That is, they're going to edit images that are made up of a certain number of pixels. So like when you zoom in on this cupcake, you can see that it is made up of pixels. Unlike Adobe Illustrator, which is a vector-based editing program. So Adobe Lightroom basically is for processing camera raw files, and then for organizing them. And it's got a couple other features that aren't so great that are in there, like the book feature where you kind of do a clumsy book layout. But its main thing is to take raw camera data and make it into a raster file for editing. So for example, Photoshop can do the same thing, and it's got some of the same interface. So let's go ahead and actually look at what that looks like. So I'm gonna come up to File, Open, and then I need to go to a raw file. So in this case, these CR2 files are Canon files. And so since it's CR2, that tells me that it's a Canon raw file. And I can go ahead and open it, and it should open up. And let me make sure it's sharing correctly. Yeah, camera raw, here it is. There we go. So you can see this kind of storm picture. So this is the camera raw editor for Photoshop, and it's called, Adobe Camera Raw. So when you're in Lightroom, this is very similar to the Develop tab. So Bridge would be the library tab. This would be the Develop tab. And just like in Lightroom, you have all these ways to move and adjust images. And since it's so similar to Lightroom and I'm not going to go too far into this part of Photoshop. I really want to get into how Photoshop itself works, because Adobe Camera Raw is almost like its own thing. But it's a way for converting your raw files into a file you can edit. So let's poke around and take a look at the layout of Photoshop, and then we'll start looking at individual tools. So the first thing that you'll do once you have an image open, which you can just go to File, Open, and open any image, is you need to lay out your workspace. So Workspace is kind of hidden. It's going to be under this little square up here in the top right. And when you click down on it, it gives you a bunch of basic setups based on what you're doing. And I'm going to reset my workspace so it looks like what yours would look like. And then I'm going to pick photography. Essentials isn't super useful for us. Photography can be very useful. And what it'll do is it's not going to necessarily remove any tools, but it's going to move them around and nestle stuff differently. And it's just going to bring out stuff that you're much more likely to use to the forefront. So once you have it open, your layout will have all of your tools over here on the left. So this is what we're going to call our toolbar. And it's for, pulling out a certain tool to make a particular kind of, usually a targeted edit to the image. Across the top, we're going to have our options bar. And the options bar, and you notice as I click through these different tools, will change, and it's individual options for each tool. So it's ways that we can control what the tool is doing. And then over here on the right, we have our panels. Let me make sure I'm on the wrong. Yeah, let's go to the screen. There we go. Should look a little bit clearer now. So over here on the right, we have our panels. And these panels are ways of making global edits along with some organization and other things like that. And then extremely importantly, this is where we're going to have what's called layers. So how you can navigate through all this stuff is you'll notice that there's these little arrows at the top of these panels. And this allows me to open and close them, kind of collapse them up and down. And then if I want, I can also straight up remove some of these. So like here's the libraries panel right here. And you can see that I've got some stuff stored in it. And what library is for is that it's going to have stuff that I can sync across all of my different Adobe accounts. But in this case, it's not useful for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. And then clone source, I almost never use. So I'm going to go ahead and close that one. And what I'm doing is I'm right clicking on this tab to close it. History is going to be very useful. So what history will do is every time I make some sort of edit, so you see like where I'm drawing these little X's on here, I get a different step in my history. So this is, your undo button. So literally I can hit Command Z or go up to edit and undo, and it will walk me backwards in this history. So this is something that's very useful and nice about Photoshop, is it visualizes out this history. Now, if I go back a couple of steps, you'll see that these ones right here are grayed out. And what that means is if I make a new step, I'd make a new edit, those old future steps go away. The other time that these steps will go away is when I close Photoshop. When I close the file, I'll lose anything that's in my history. Just kind of like in Microsoft Word, you lose your undo in that particular document when you close it. Similarly, depending on how you have this set up, there's a max number of steps that it'll keep track of. I think the default is 25 steps or 40 steps, depending on like what it reads off your system. So depending on your computer, it'll have defaulted it to a certain number of steps, and you can change that up in your Photoshop preferences if you want more steps. Anyway, if I click right here where it says regular editing.cr2, the file name for it, it will take me back to my original version of this picture. So again, tools, toolbar, and then panels. When you have multiple images open, each image is going to have its own tab right here. And I can click on those tabs, move between them, and then I can click on the X's to close any of these that I don't want open anymore. So let's take a look at some very general corrections. So here we have Lee the puppy, cute dog. And the picture is much, much too dark. And I can kind of confirm that not only visually where I see that it looks too dark, but I have something over here called my histogram up in the top right. And so what my histogram allows me to do is to literally see in a numerical way where all of my tones are. And so I can see that I don't have any tones to the right of this spot right here, which means all of this area for brights is missing. So like this is all dark area. This is all bright areas that are missing in the picture. And so I want to stretch this histogram back out to have a full range of tones in this image. And to do that, I have a bunch of options. And each one of these options is going to be something that I call an adjustment layer. So I can make an adjustment layer by coming up to Layer and doing New Adjustment Layer and picking from this menu. I can also make an adjustment layer by being in this Adjustments tab and clicking on any one of these buttons. And in Layers, I can come down here and I can click on this half circle, and I have that big list of adjustments right here as well. And like, I can make a levels adjustment using all three of those methods, and it's going to make the same levels adjustment, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and click on levels. So now that I clicked on levels, over here in my layers panel, I now have two layers. One is my original image, and one is my levels adjustment. So I can hide or deactivate any one of these layers by poking it in the eye. So like if I poke this dog layer in the eye, it disappears. And then once I start making adjustments to this levels layer, let me just make one real quick. If I poke this eyeball, that adjustment layer gets turned off. So when I have an adjustment layer active, like I do right now, so like I have this, I've clicked on this levels layer, I can then use this properties tab to start making adjustments using this tool. So what the level tool does is allows me to reassign points on here for my histogram to say, I actually want this tone right here to now be white. So like I have my slider over here on the right. This is going to be my white slider, and it kind of gives me a hint by making this light. I have a black point slider, and I have a gray point slider. So if I drag this over, you'll see that the brighter tones in here will get brighter, but the darker the tone is, the less of an effect it's having. So like if we look at these nice deep dark shadows in here, they're not going to move very much. So this is a very easy way to stretch this histogram out and to have a brighter image. Same thing, if I wanted to darken the image, I could then drag the dark slider, or if I wanted to kind of add a little bit of mid-tone contrast, I can start dragging this one to the right, or remove contrast by dragging this to the left. Which, why don't we actually pull out a little bit of that contrast? I'm going to drag this a little bit to the left. So we've got a little bit of a washed out image, but it's brighter, and it's going to be easier to work with in a second. So again, I can poke this eyeball and I can see the effect that this layer is having. So I'm going to poke it in the eyeball, and let's look at some other ways that we could brighten this. We have brightness and contrast, which is exactly what it sounds like when you activate it or click on it. It makes a new layer, and you have a brightness and contrast slider. And you can kind of see how it's not as powerful as the levels tool, but it's going to be doing kind of it's going to be doing much similar things. Like I can drag the brightness up and it will brighten the image, but I don't have as much control over these white point values and gray values as I do in levels. So this one isn't useful for me. I'm not going to come back to it. So rather than just hiding it so I don't have it anymore, I'm going to delete this layer. And to delete a layer, I'll have it active. So it's selected right now. You can see that it's a little bit lighter. And I can click this trash can down here in the bottom right. And it'll ask me, do I want to delete it? Yes. And I can delete out the layer. And notice when I deleted it, it only deleted that mask. So I'm going to have to click delete again. Doing more on what this mask is in a second. I can also use curves to make my brightness adjustment. So I've got that histogram again, and I can click anywhere on this line to add an adjustment point and then drag in the direction I want those tones to go. So like a very common edit is to drag your highlights up and drag your shadows down to make kind of an S curve. In this case, since this picture is so dark already, I would mostly be using this to brighten. So like I'd come over here and brighten up to there. And then I would probably make a second curves layer and then make that S adjustment to it, just because it comes out a little bit better when you do it that way. Now, when I have this layer selected, it defaults to the mask, which is what it's assuming that I want to use. So I actually need to click on this little circle for me to be able to delete both at once. So let's delete out those curves. We have exposure control. This is another way of brightening images, and kind of like the brightness and contrast. It's going to try to mimic camera exposure. I don't use this one very often because these other ones have a little bit more control. But it's the same kind of idea in that tool. So again, we'll just delete this one. Now there's a bunch of other ways that we can brighten stuff, but those are our main ones. So I'm going to turn back on our levels adjustment. So right now, I like how much brighter it is, but it looks a little washed out. So this is where that curves adjustment can be great. So I'm going to add one more curves adjustment, and I'll drag up a little bit and I'll drag down a little bit to make that nice little S curve, and it makes the image a little bit more punchy or contrasty. Next on this image, it looks too blue, and this one's going to be relative. So like this is where you have a little bit more kind of artistic freedom on it. It's like, do you want it to feel cold or do you want it to feel warm? So how do we adjust colors in an image? So moving down the list, we have Vibrance, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like how vibrant the colors are. And I'm going to come back and do this one after I've changed the blue. So I'm going to click right here, back up to new Vibrance, back up to layer visibility to remove me adding that step. And instead, I'm going to look at Hue and Saturation, color balance. So let's open up Hue and Saturation. And it gives me 3 sliders. One of them is kind of a general overall color feel to it. You can see how it shifts the hues. Saturation is exactly what it sounds like. I can make the colors very saturated. And then lightness allows me to darken or lighten the image again. Doesn't actually look that useful right now, does it? However, this can be very useful. So I'm going to come back up to new saturation layer in my history. So now it's all zeroed back out. And if I click where it says master, this is where hue and saturation gets very interesting. I can pick individual color groups. So let's say it was just these green tones that I felt were too cold. I can pick those greens and I can slide those greens around to adjust their color. Same thing if I wanted them darker, I can use lightness to darken just those green tones. All right, backing out of having that hue saturation, so you see me clicking back in history to remove it. I'm going to go ahead and grab the one that I want to use the most, which is color balance. Color balance splits up the image into 6 colors, and I can kind of move the sliders around to warm up the image. So I have cyan versus red. In this case, I want to add just a hint of red, and then blue versus yellow. I want to add in a little bit of yellow to remove out some of that blue. Maybe not quite that much red. And then we can click the eyeball to see the effect, and we can see how much warmer the image feels now. I can also target, for it to be more biased towards the highlights or shadows. So, the shadows in this are much cooler than the highlights. So if I really wanted to, I could come into shadows and add in just a little bit of yellow into those shadows to really kind of help warm it all up. But I don't think it's necessary in this case. Other things that we can do to this. So we've got a couple other options in here. So if we wanted to convert to black and white, we could click in to go in black and white. Photo filter layer is interesting. If you are used to film from old photography days, this will emulate different warming or cooling filters or color filters from old school photography. And incidentally, actually adding this warming filter looks pretty good. So I think I'll keep that. Channel Mixer. This is a fancy tool for when you really get into understanding how digital images are made. So I would skip Channel Mixer for now. Color Lookup, we'll skip that one. Invert, Posterize Threshold, and Selective Color. These are all fancy editing styles that if you really get into Photoshop, you'll use to do certain kind of special effects. All right, so what we've looked at so far is making global adjustments to an image. So what if we wanted to only edit part of an image? We need to make something called a selection. And we'll come back to this dog in a minute to make some selections, but I'm going to come over to this cupcake to talk about ways of selecting things. Ooh, that is a good question. Remind me at the end to come to that actions one, and we'll definitely cover that one. So what a selection is exactly what it sounds like. It's like when you're working on a Microsoft Word document and you want to just italicize a word, you have to select that word. So if I wanted to change the color of just this cupcake, I need to select the cupcake and then edit it separately from the rest of the image. So over here on the left, we have all of our tools. The first one is the move tool, and this is for what sounds like moving things around. And then the next three are different ways of selecting things. So if we click on the first one, it's just a marquee selection, what's called. It makes a rectangle. So you click and drag with it, and it will make a rectangle, and you can see what we call the marching ants tell us the edges of our selection. And so if I grab the move tool and unlock this, I can move that section around, or if I make a adjustment layer, I can brighten or darken just that part of the image. So in this case, that doesn't do me any good for this cupcake. I'm gonna go back to the original by clicking on the file name again. If I click and hold on the marquee tool, I can see that I've got the elliptical tool in there, which also isn't useful in this case. And then underneath that, I have the lasso tool. The lasso tool, if I was feeling masochistic, I could come through and I can very carefully draw around this cupcake to select it, which I'm not going to do because it would take a long time and not be fun and not turn out very well. What would make it easier, though, is something called the magnetic lasso tool. So if we click and hold on the lasso tool, we have the magnetic lasso tool. And what that does, it's the same idea, except I click once and then release, and I drag along the edge that I want it to select. And you can see how it tries to find that edge for me. It does an okay job. Again, not the right tool in this case. Also in there is the polygonal lasso tool, which is what it sounds like. You can draw polygons with this selection tool. Very useful at times, but not for our cupcake. Underneath that, we have our three smart selection styles. We have Object Select, which is brand new. They released it back in December. Quick Select Tool, which is my favorite. And then the old school Magic Wand. So we'll start with Magic Wand. And what Magic Wand does is wherever you click, it's going to try to figure out, what that is. Like if I click on this green area, it's not giving me that much. If I click back here where I've got tones more similar to each other, it will pick those. And I can adjust how close of a tone, so like anywhere I pick, it's going to be like, look at that pixel and pick anything close to it in terms of appearance. And I can change how close it has to be with this tolerance up here. So, if I put in 35 and I click on this splotch, I get way more of the splotch. Or if I come down to the cupcake, I get way more of the cupcake. So if I wanted to, I could, go in and kind of start trying to dial it in till it gets enough of that cupcake. I can also, and this is the cool part, hold down the Shift key and notice how a little plus sign appears next to my cursor and add to my selection. And this will work with any tool that's for selecting, by the way. If I hold down the plus key, it adds. If I hold down the Alt Option key, it instead subtracts that from my selection. And you can see that all it's doing is it's changing which one of these boxes up here I have selected. So notice I have select, so it selects. I have add to my selection, so I want to add that hand, I could click on it. I have subtract, so let's say I wanted to subtract the sky, I can click on the sky. And then I have only keep the overlap, which is less useful for us today, so we won't get too far into it. All right, so none of these selections are very useful for me. So I'm going to come up to selection and go to deselect. So right now I have nothing selected. The one that I probably want to use is the quick select tool. Now, you see a giant circle with a plus sign in it. In order to make my mouse easier for you guys to see, I've made my mouse about 10 times larger than normal. So keep in mind that when I'm brushing on here and it seems like it's only hitting a certain area. So for example, this paintbrush, notice how small of a red dot it's making. That's the size of my actual cursor if I had shrunk it back down. But I've made my cursor very large for you guys to see. So when I'm painting with this tool, keep that in mind. So this one, the quick select tool, is I just click and paint over anything I want selected, and it will intelligently figure out what I want. I'm just going to paint over this cupcake real quick. and I have my cupcake. It's that easy. So let's change the color of my cupcakes. You know, I could come over to Hue Saturation and be like, I don't know, different, make it blue. So this allows me to target only that part of the image. Super, super powerful. Notice though that my selection went away. So what happened here? So let's go back to where I have that selection active. So I've got these little dots, and let's make that adjustment layer again, Hue Saturation. Selection disappears, but now my little white box over here, so like when I make just a normal one, I get a white one. Now my little white box right here is black. What this is called is a layer mask. And what a layer mask is it saves your selection. So anywhere that's black in my layer mask is where this adjustment layer won't have any effect. And anywhere that it's white, it will have full effect. Hence, you know, white cupcake, cupcake gets adjusted. And I can always edit this further with brushes. So if I click on that mask and make it active, I can click the brush tool and switch to black or white, because gray will be, you know, like half effect or whatever % gray I have it set to. And I can paint out part of this area to say, you know what, I really didn't want that frosting. So I could paint out the frosting with the brush tool if I wanted to. You notice down here that this is changed. Now this will only work if I have that mask active. So like if I have my background layer active and I try to use this brush, I brush onto it. So I need to have the layer mask active. And this is something that confuses a lot of early students and people who start using Photoshop at the start, is you have to make sure that you have the right part of your layer active for your tools to work on it. Similarly, I don't necessarily have to use the brush tool. I could also come back over to the select and I can reselect the frosting, and I can right click on my layer mask and I can say subtract or intersect or add mask to selection. You know, I can say like, and I can remove, excuse me, I can remove, oops, I did that backwards. There we go. I can remove this from the layer mask. So, you know, let's just paint it in black. And so now it's removed. All right, so if we come back to the dog picture, let's say I just want to darken the edges of this picture. So how can I just darken the edges of this or add what's called a vignette? So let's make a levels adjustment, and let's drag this middle slider over a little bit so it darkens the image. And then I'm going to make sure that I have my layer mask active. And you know what? Let's come back up to those marquee tools. So I'm going to click and hold on the marquee tool and go to the elliptical marquee tool. And in the elliptical marquee tool, I have something called feathering. So right now, if I just draw a marquee or an oval over this dog like this, and you know, I paint this in black. So edit, fill, black. I get a nasty, nasty hard edge. Like, doesn't do me any good. So if I want to have a soft edge, I can feather it. So let's try, I don't know, 50 pixels feathering. I'm going to click on the center of the dog's head, and notice how like it's not centered on there. These hotkeys take a while to learn, but if I hold down the Alt key, it will base it. It'll center what I'm drawing based on that spot. And I'm going to release. And I'm going to come up to Edit, Fill, and I'm going to pick black because that's what I want to fill in over here on my mask. Hit Deselect, and notice how much softer that edge is. Now, if I wanted to, you know, have even more control over it, I could grab the brush tool, and up here in the controls, I can open up this control and I can set the hardness to 0, make the brush very large, and I can start brushing over, whoops, actually I need even a bigger brush. My, again, my mouse is kind of lying to me on the size of my brush from making it bigger so it's easier for you guys to see. And you can see how like I can paint out some of those edges of the soft part of this brush to kind of just darken those edges. And again, down here is a preview of what we are doing with it. All right, something else that can be very useful is you notice that we're starting to get a lot of layers. So I can double click on the letter part of this and I can start adding labels to stuff. So like I could label this one Vignette. I can label this one warming layer. What was this one? I don't even remember. So this one's warming layer. This one was our brightening layer. So we'll label this one brightening. And we'll label this one contrast, because that's what we did. We added contrast with it. So labeling your layers can make it easier for you to find things. And then once you start getting a lot of layers, it can also be useful to group them. So I'm going to click on brightening layer, and then if I hold down the shift key, I can select more than one layer at a time. And I can click this folder icon down here in the bottom to put it in a folder. So I can label this one tone adjustments. And then I can grab both of these. So again, I'm going to hold down the shift key. So I've got both of them. Click the folder icon, label this one color adjustments. And I'll leave the vignette on its own. So now I can it's also grouped now in a way that allows me to target, all of the color adjustments at once or all of my tone adjustments at once. All right, so cool stuff, right? Let's open up an image and look at some things for removing. So I'm going to come up to File. I'm going to open up a landscape image. So where is it? There it is, landscape crabs. Open. So it opens it up in Adobe Camera Raw first. So I'm just going to skip the Camera Raw stuff and bring it into Photoshop. And here we have a not bad landscape, right? But we've got this Typhoon H drone right here in the center of it. And you know what? This Typhoon H drone just doesn't do it for me. So let's look at all the different ways that we can remove stuff in Photoshop. And it's pretty powerful. The other thing that we can also talk about is how am I navigating right now? Like how am I moving around? So if I click on this guy right here, my magnifying glass tool, this allows me to zoom in. And if I click on the minus one, it allows me to zoom out. I can say fit screen, fill screen, or 100%, so like full resolution, and zoom in and out all I want. However, it's way easier to use hotkeys. So if you hold down Command on an Apple computer or Control on a Windows computer and hit the plus or minus keys, it zooms in and out for you. And then Command 0 also fits the screen. It takes a little bit to learn these hotkeys, but again, Command minus, Command plus, just like in most programs, or Control minus, Control plus to zoom in or out. And so also, if I'm zoomed in really far, it can be irritating to move or adjust your viewpoint with having to zoom in on any given point. So if I hold down the space bar on my computer, I'll get this tool right here, which is called the hand tool. What that allows me to do is to click and drag my view around on the screen. Similarly, if any reason you don't feel like using that tool, I can also open up my Navigator panel, and I've got a slider right here for zooming in and out. And then I can also click and drag in my Navigator to move my view around. So I'm going to zoom in on Mr. Drone right here, and let's look at some ways of getting rid of him. So fitting up with what we were just talking about with Mr. Cupcake, we can remove the drone through selections. So I'm going to grab the Lasso tool, and I'm just going to, draw lazily around this guy. Super lazy. And so now I have my drone selected, and I can use, and there's a lot of tools for this, by the way. I can use a tool called Content Aware Fill for Photoshop to remove this drone, and it's just going to guess. So I'm going to zoom out so we can see the whole picture. So again, Command minus, and I'm going to come up to Edit, and I want Content Aware Fill. Content Aware Fill just got a very large update, so it's a much more robust panel than it used to be. Because it used to just be a button click and it would just do its thing. And now I have the ability to tell Photoshop where I want it to copy from. So over here on the left, we have our original image. Over here on the right, we have the result, just, the drone is gone. And here on the right, anywhere that's green is the part of the image that it's going to look at for removing the drone. And in this case, it does a very good job. But, say that for whatever reason, I'm going to click on this brush right here. I'm going to click plus. I'm going to say, why don't you look at adding in some ground into that area as well. And it should, depending on how smart it is, start contaminating in the sky. Erase out the sky so you can kind of see what that looks like. Ooh, you can see, see it's got less sky to copy from, so it's having a harder time. Yeah, it really just doesn't want, it knows. Photoshop is too smart for this. It knows that it doesn't want to copy from the ground. You can see that the less of the sky that we have going for it, the less accurate, the less good that it's getting at it. See if that does it. You can see that it's, so now it's just copying in the ground and it looks gross. Anyway, I'm not going to use this one, but in this case, which often this is the right one to use for these bigger edits. So I'm going to click cancel to cancel out of it. And then I'm going to deselect my selection because I want to actually look at some other tools. So I'm going to come up to select and go to deselect. So again, that one was you select it, you go to edit, you go to content or where fill. Very powerful, very smart way to remove things. Other ways we can remove things are with more targeted edits. So we looked at our move, our selections. This is crop, by the way, if you want to crop your image. Pretty self-explanatory. The eyedropper we're not going to get into today. But this healing brush tool, we will. So we've got two healing brushes. We've got spot and regular healing brush. Spot healing tool is the easiest one to use, but it also means it's making the most decisions for you. So I need to change the size of my healing brush in order to start painting this guy out. So I'm going to come up here and click the drop down and make it bigger. Or I can also right click on the screen with my mouse to get the same options. And so again, my mouse is going to be much larger than what the actual brush size is. And again, just to make it easier for you guys to see the brush. So I'm going to make this pretty big, 94. You can see that little black dot right there is about the size that it's making. And that black dot's actually about right for removing that little power control panel. So I'm just going to brush over it and it's gone. And what about you? And missed it. And it's gone. Let's zoom in a little bit. And you know what? Let's say that these trees were in Soviet Russia and they displeased Stalin, so they get removed from the photos like that general. And you can brush over them and they're gone. So if I make this even bigger, didn't like that. Got mad because of the way I clicked there. If I make this even bigger, I can start working on this drone. So I'm just going to paint. I'm just going to click and hold the mouse key down and just paint over the drone and remove it. Notice how soft the edge of this brush is. So if I wanted to, I could make the edge of this brush harder. And I'll show you guys how to do that in a second to make it a little bit easier to use. But generally, you want to keep these brushes when you're healing soft on the edge because it kind of helps blend it in with the sides. And it didn't do a bad job, not a perfect job. So I can just come back over it again and remove out some of these other splotches, after the fact. Although keep in mind, each time that you apply a healing brush to a spot, the spot will look less good. It won't be as good as it could be. So that's spot healing brush. Let's say I wanted more control when I'm removing something. So like when we were removing this guy right here, like it has a little bit of trouble sometimes. So there's that stop sign. There it goes. And you can see how it just pulled in a random tree. So how can I keep it from doing things like pulling in random trees? That's where the other healing brush tool comes in. So if I click on this guy, I get a brush, and if I try to click on anything, it gives me this error. It's just like you have to define a source. And so I can define a source by holding down the Alt Option key, and I get a nice little crosshairs. So I'll crosshair. Let me see if we want to remove that. I'm going to crosshair from a spot that would look good to put there. So, about this, and I'll click, and I'll release the Alt key. And now you can see that I get a little circle that's a preview of the area that I'm going to copy from. And so let's mouse over, and I can line it up, and I click, and it's gone. So what this does, unlike the spot healing brush tool, what this one does is it's going to copy a spot based on where I tell it to copy from and go, how do I blend the edges? And it blends the edges for me. Now, if I wanted to, I could also copy without blending the edges. So that's what this clone tool is. So I'm going to zoom out. And let's say that I actually wanted to, add drones. So this is where I could use the clone tool, which is going to work just like the healing brush tool, except it's not going to try to blend in the edges. So let's sample off the drone, and let's make my mouse big enough to have that drone in there. And, maybe not quite that big. Yeah, we'll click and paint. So, we can see the drone, and then I can click and paint around. You can see the little crosshair on the left that's showing me my source for if I wanted to, start doubling up the drone. And then I would come in with the spot healing brush tool and go over those edges to start kind of blending those edges into place, which is kind of a really basic way to do it. There's better ways to do it, but it works enough in this case. All right, back to normal. One last way to do it, if I don't want to have to go through the rigmarole of content-aware fill when I select something to remove, so, like I lasso Mr. Drone right here, I can use the patch tool. So spot healing, healing brush, patch. And so if I click on the patch tool, I can click on something I want to remove. And I can say, you see how I'm dragging around on the screen and it's previewing what it's going to look like when it fills that in there. So I can line up that blue edge right there, and not bad. Edge isn't great, but not super bad. So this is a way of using selections to pick where I want to copy from to remove stuff. A little yellow down there, isn't it? In this case, this one isn't going to turn out super stellar just because, it's going to be hard to get the clouds in there. So not bad on removing stuff. All right, so let's talk about how to get stuff out of Photoshop. So let's say we're happy with our dog picture and we want to save it. So you're going to want to do a couple of things on saving. First is you're going to want to save your original version, the version that you can come back to and edit. So if I want to keep these layers over here and be able to, undo it and change them after the fact, I need to save it in a special format to keep these here. So if I go up to File and I go to Save As, I get a drop down that looks like this. If yours looks small and kind of anemic like this one, there's this little arrow right here to open and expand it, allowing you to pick a spot to save it to. Luckily, if you have these layers active, it's already going to put it in the format you want, which is what's called a PSD or Photoshop file format. Underneath here, don't put on save as a copy because that's just going to make a duplicate copy. Layers, yes, because that's how you're going to be able to readjust these after the fact. And then, yes, you want to embed whatever color profile you're in. Color profiles is a very large subject, but yes, you want them embedded. And so then you'll just click save, and it will save a PSD to your computer, so you can always come back and edit this. Now, a PSD isn't shareable on the internet, so we need to make this shareable. So for an image to be shareable, we need to put it into something like a JPEG or PNG format. And we're also going to want to make it smaller. So full resolution on this image, oops, wrong tool, is, quite large. So we don't want to send on the internet a picture this big. It takes forever to upload. They don't need this much resolution, and you'll just irritate people. So we need to make this smaller. So I'm going to zoom out so I can see the whole thing. And then I'm going to actually change the size of this thing, because zooming in and out isn't changing the size. Yes, a PSD file is printable, but it's going to be printable for you. You won't actually want to send professional printers a PSD file. You'll send them a TIFF or a PDF file, which I'll get to in a second. So if I come up to image and I go to image size, this is how I can resample my image to make it smaller. So when I opened up this window, so again, image size, I get this tab or this little window. This window tells me its size on my disk, so 287 megabytes, fairly large. It tells me how many pixels by how many pixels big it is. So anything over 2,500 pixels is considered high resolution. This guy, you know, at 8600, this is a 5DS file, which is a very, very large file. So most of your file sizes will be much smaller than this. Then, interestingly, I've got width, height, and resolution. So I can change this into any of these modes except for pixels right now. And the reason why I can't change the pixel size right now is because when I'm changing the size on this one, so let's say I type in 20 inches, notice how my resolution changes. So right now, without resample on, all I'm doing is changing how many pixels there are in a square inch of this if I were to print it off. So this is having zero effect on how it looks on the screen right now. So if I type in 4 inches, notice the pixel count stays the same, but I've made it smaller, right? All I'm doing right now by not resampling it is making more pixels in any given inch of this. So this isn't what I want to do. So let's look at, it was at what, 300, there we go. So let's look at how to make it actually smaller. So I need to click on resample. And so by clicking on resample, when I change this size, it's going to discard if I'm making it smaller or add if I'm making it bigger pixels to the image. And when I add pixels, by the way, it's just going to guess about what should go in there. This isn't a way of adding details. Like I could double the number of pixels in this, but I'm not actually making the picture clearer. I'm just, you know, spreading out the size. Like it doesn't make it look clear. So then I can click on where it says inches, and I'll click pixels now. And I can put in a size appropriate for sharing on the web. So like back in the 90s, it was 400. You know, sad times for us who have pictures from way back then. Then, you know, like in the early 2000s, it was 600. In the mid 2000s, it was 900. And then these days, it's 1200 to 2000 pixels is considered good for sharing on the web because that will fit most people's screens very well. And it's not a huge file. So you can see this drops it down to, even as a PSD right now, 5.5 megabytes. And once we convert it to a JPEG, even fewer. Often on the internet, you'll see people say that you want to switch this resolution to 72. That isn't a thing anymore. Don't worry about it. So if I click OK, it's going to discard those pixels. So when I zoom in now and fill the screen, you can start seeing the appearance of pixels in here because I've gotten rid of that extra data, which is nice because, again, it's going to make it easier to share on the web. Now, depending on how I want to send this to somebody, I need to flatten my image. So I'm going to get rid of these layers. So I'm going to come up to Layer. I'm going to go to Flatten Image, and it removes those layers. Now I'm ready to save this as a JPEG for sharing. So I come up to File, and I'll go to Save As. I want to do Save As. If I do Save, I'm going to overwrite that PSD file as this, you know, low resolution pixeler that would make me very sad. So I want to do Save As. And now in this drop down where it says Photoshop, I'm going to pick JPEG, and now I can send this picture to all my friends and upload it to Instagram and Facebook and stuff. A couple other things about some of these other spaces down here. We have PNG. So sometimes you'll read on the internet that PNG is the file format. Can you guys see this screen? Oh, you have the wrong, give me a second. There, do you guys see the, sorry about that. Can you guys see the save window now? I'm sorry, with the way that it shares screens, some of those windows, you guys didn't see the image size thing, did you? Did that pop up correctly? Yes, no? All right, good. All right. I'm sorry. When you share your screen a certain way, sometimes the windows don't pop up. Sorry about that. So when you're saving, you'll click this drop down. You'll pick JPEG. A JPEG is what we call a lossy format. So every time you save a JPEG, it gets slightly worse. But they're good enough these days that it's not a huge issue. Back in early internet days, it was a much bigger issue with how the compression happened. Since it compresses it, though, it makes it a much smaller file format. So this isn't an arc. It's like an audio cassette tape. Every time you play an audio cassette tape, it gets a little worse. Other file formats to talk about. So we have PNG. So this is a lossless one. So you can save this one as many times as you want without affecting the file format. Without affecting the file quality, but it means it'll be a lot bigger. So you'll often see people on the internet say, save everything in PNG, but as long as you have your original PSD file, there's no reason to ever use PNGs. PNGs support transparency, which is really nice for web designers and people building graphics that need to be not square. But for us photographers or people working in digital arts for like a regular stuff, PNG doesn't really serve that much purpose. If I was going to send this off to a printer, I would not actually flatten my image or back out or anything like that. So let me go back to my layer visibility save as. So you can see right here where it says save as. It tells me that's the last time I saved. I'm going to hit Command-0 to fit it onto my screen. So I've got all my layers again and everything like that. So if I was going to send this off to a printer, and it's a good printer, so not like Amazon prints or whatever, I'll go up to File, Save As, and I want to send them what's called a Tiff file. A Tiff file is going to store and save a lot more color information and won't have any compression in it. So this is great to send to printers if you've got a picture with very hard to print colors. Like this is what you'll want to send them. You could also send them a PDF if they're comfortable with PDFs, but that's losing support unless you're working with somebody who knows a little bit more about printing. TIFF is the one that you'll often send them. Although honestly, for most of us, JPEG is fine for sending to printers unless you're starting to get into like fine art quality level. Let me check my notes, see if there's anything we've missed. Yeah, talk about one more thing and then I'll talk about those Photoshop actions. So when you first start up this program, it can be useful to come to Image, Mode, and then make sure you're in 16 bits per channel. This will give you more color information. It'll give you more space to work in for color. And then if you're wondering what color space your image should be in, and this is a little bit more advanced, so this is kind of for the people that have been through Photoshop a little bit before. If you come down to Edit and go into Color Settings, there's 3 color spaces that will be fairly common for people working in photography if it'll open it. Getting beach ball of death right now. Which is sRGB, Adobe 98 RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. As long as you're in Adobe RGB, you'll be fairly safe. Most web browsers are supporting this one now. But if you're sharing on the web, sRGB is what you'll want to be in. If you're printing, you'll want to be in Adobe RGB. ProPhoto RGB is great. It's just very difficult to work in unless you really, really know your color stuff. Let's talk about those Photoshop actions because they can be very, very useful. Let me change the way my screen is sharing. There we go. So if I come over to my Actions tab, which by the way, if my Actions tab wasn't open, so let's say it was closed and not here, I could come up to Window, Actions to reopen any tab that I close. So what an action is a saved series of steps. So I frequently resize my stuff for sharing on the web. So I have something set up to do all of that work for me. So like I click on Web Prep, I click the play button, it will flatten my image, resize it, and then open up the save window for me to save the image. So, you know, that means I don't have to go through each one of those steps every single time I share an image on the internet. It allows me to do it with a single button press. So let me back out to where it was before. So the question was, let me scroll up. If you purchase an action or a filter from a photographer, would those be stored in that list of filters you just stored? What you'll do is you'll import them into here. And all these are saved steps that somebody else has done already. So, so like Webscape, Landscape one. So you can see I have my flatten image step that flattens my image, converts my color profile, changes my image size, and save. And I can make these pretty easily. It's like I can click a new one, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick because this is advanced. Like this is something you'd want to read up on. And then anytime I make a change to the image, it's going to appear, as you can see down here, as a step, which would then allow me to play it and use it again if I wanted to each time that I, click the play button. Stop. So you can see like I've got set my background, and so on. Not that I want that, so I'm going to take those off. All right, we've got a handful of minutes left. Does anyone have any questions about what we've looked at or what we've done so far today? How many features are missing in Elements? What would we be giving up? I'm not that familiar with Photoshop Elements. I haven't used it in 15 years. So I don't really know what's missing from it. I could look that up real quick at the end, unless we don't have any other questions. Let me take a quick peek then. Let me see what's missing in Photoshop Elements. Honestly, the regular Photoshop is cheap enough these days that I don't, unless you're purchasing a subscription for Photoshop Elements, unless you're purchasing a hard copy for Photoshop Elements, which I'm not sure is even a thing anymore. I don't really see any reason to not just get regular Photoshop because it's what, $10, $12 a month right now. Although maybe they did just raise their price. Yeah, so in Photoshop, you can buy, Photoshop Elements allows you to buy just the program, which is interesting. Without getting further into it, it's going to be hard to see what's missing. But, like regular Photoshop's cheap enough that I would just get that. How do you place text? Placing text is fairly easy. Like in any Adobe program, you will look for the T icon over here in your tools, standing for text. So you can click onto it, and you'll click anywhere on your screen that you want to add text. So, I don't know, happy. And it will start to add the text. Then you have very basic controls across the top here for changing it. So I'm going to select my text by double clicking on it, and then I can start changing the size of it, just like in any word editor. I can come into here. Oops, this one doesn't have a bold. So I can click right here where it says Orthodox or Bavarian and, pick a different font and then, do, semi-bold italic if that's what I want. And I can change the color by clicking into this box right here as well. And then if I need further control than that for my text, I actually have a whole nother tab over here. So in properties, I've got quite a bit of control over it. And then also if I come into window and go into characters, I have a whole nother tab just for characters that also gives me a lot of options for editing it. So like if I wanted to make them all, caps with lower ones. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't quickly answer that question about the difference between Photoshop Elements and regular Photoshop. It's been too long since I've looked at Elements. Most Adobe programs are going to be subscription-based these days. A lot of companies will have a way for you to get it cheaper through them. So like I know that UNMC does like a cheaper monthly subscription for some of their employees. If you're a teacher, it's cheaper. If you're a student, it's cheaper. Otherwise, without double checking, I want to say Photoshop and Lightroom, which should come with Bridge, should be something like $10, $12 a month. And then the full Creative Suite is $30 a month. Do you need elements to edit video? So if you want to edit video, you can edit video in Photoshop. I wouldn't. It's clunky, difficult, irritating, and kind of a horrible experience. I made my students do it a couple of times. And the feedback was also very negative from them. There's other programs that are better for that. So like for general timeline editing, you'd want to look at something called Adobe Premiere, or honestly, some of the non-Adobe products are very good. So that would be like DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro are also really good options for editing video. Photoshop is almost exclusively for photos. It's possible to make videos in it, but it's not fun to make videos in it. And unless you're doing fairly fancy stuff, if you're on an Apple computer, iMovie works okay, and it's, you know, free. All right, unless we have any other questions, I'm going to call it. Nice talking to all of you guys, and I hope this has been good. Do you need Photoshop or Lightroom or both? If you're doing high volume editing, I would 100% go with Lightroom. If you're going to be combining multiple pictures into one or doing very difficult targeted editing, I would use Photoshop. So like when I shoot weddings, I almost exclusively use Lightroom because it's just not worth my time to bring them each and every photo into Photoshop. Lightroom allows me to batch edit very, very quickly. But for like my fine art stuff where I'm going to be doing some very intricate compositing or editing, I'm 100% going to be doing that in Photoshop, if that distinction makes sense. All right, thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.